Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining me today for episode 852 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we're resharing our conversation with our guest, Dr. Andrew Friedman. Listeners, Andy is an astrophysicist and cosmologist. He studies the history of the universe from the Big Bang through present day, using observations of astronomical objects in other galaxies to learn about fundamental physics and quantum mechanics. And in our conversation, Andy shared some great insights and stories. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Andrew Friedman. So, Andy, welcome to our show today. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. We are so excited to have you with us and to learn more about you and your work. But let me first take a moment here to tell our listeners a little bit about you and your background. So, listeners, Andy is an assistant research scientist at the Center for Astrophysics and Space Sciences at the University of California, San Diego. He is also a research affiliate at MIT, and he received his bachelor's degree in physics and astrophysics from the University of California, Berkeley. His master's and PhD degrees were awarded in astronomy and astrophysics from Harvard University. Afterwards, Andy worked as a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow at MIT, a National Science Foundation funded research associate at MIT, and also a visiting research scientist at the MIT Center for Theoretical Physics. He joined the Center for Astrophysics and Space Sciences there at UCSD in 2017. And in our interview today, Andy, we're looking forward to learning more about you and your science, but also more about you as a person and what you do when you're not doing science. So how do you like to spend your time when you're not at work?
I guess I would say that the favorite thing for me is always having a good food, good conversation with friends and family. I think that's always been the case. And lately, it's actually been spending time with my wife and our dog. I never grew up with pets. I guess we had lizards, but nothing as complicated as dogs or cats. But having a dog later in life has been a pretty amazing experience. So I'm an astronomer, and ever since I was a kid, I always wanted to meet aliens. And having a dog as a grown-up, I realized we already have them on Earth, and they're these little fuzzy, amazing creatures. So getting to be friends with an animal with essentially another alien consciousness, I've kind of gotten a perspective that as a kid, that's what I was looking for, and I didn't realize it.
That is amazing. And I must say, going from having a Labrador retriever myself to now having a pug, I can appreciate that some dogs are more like aliens than others. So what kind of dog do you have?
He's a Cavalier and a Bichon mix. So my wife and I were aiming to get a polar bear cub that never grew up. And we had the idea in mind and went and found the right dog. And it's just been an incredible support in our lives. And it's been an amazing experience to kind of get to know what it's like to live with a small bear that walks around your house. It's pretty incredible.
I love it. And you mentioned you are a fan of good food and good conversation. I am a food fanatic myself, for better or for worse. What are some of your favorite kinds of food?
I would not say that I'm a foodie. I think my tastes are pretty simple. The pizza and pasta and burgers kind of variety. But I'm a huge fan of iced tea because I gave up sodas and various things and don't drink alcohol and that kind of stuff. But ultimately, life is about being with people you care about, and it's about sharing good times and good experiences, and there's no better way to do that than with good food, good drink, and good people.
Absolutely. Well, Andy, it's been great to get a window into life outside of science, and I'd love to talk about your work next. You do some phenomenal work, but I know it can be sometimes difficult to describe your science to people outside of your field or in the general public. So how do you describe what you do when people ask you?
For somebody who I know is actually interested, I tell them I'm an astrophysicist and a cosmologist, and basically we study the entire history of the universe from the Big Bang till today. And the big picture of what I do is we use the universe as a laboratory to learn how the world works and to do things that you could never do with a laboratory on Earth. So the common theme is to use observations of astronomical objects in other galaxies in novel ways to learn about fundamental physics. And sometimes if you want to learn how the world works at its core on the smallest of scales, let's say you're studying quantum mechanics, which is our fundamental theory of the subatomic world, sometimes, believe it or not, one of the best ways of approaching that question is actually to observe things that are on the largest of scales, on scales where it takes light billions of years from these distant galaxies, let's say, to reach us. So we kind of leverage the astronomical distances and timescales of the universe to learn about new physical questions. And there are often times where I meet people and I'm not sure if they're interested in what I do because the stuff I do is pretty esoteric and I would never want to presume that everybody shares the interests. So sometimes what I tell them depends on whether I'm in the mood to talk or not. This is actually a really common thing amongst astronomers that I find that I'm not the only one who's done this. But if, let's say I'm on an airplane, I want to talk to somebody, then I tell them I'm an astronomer if they ask me. But then, unfortunately, I often don't get asked too much about horoscopes and things like that from about half the people. So that's a sad commentary on our civilization, unfortunately. If I don't want to talk, sometimes I would say, oh, I'm an astrophysicist. And that often quiets people. If I say I'm a cosmologist, which is also true, I'm likely to get questions about hair and makeup as well. So there's some problems. So it's not only people in science who use these kinds of techniques. I have a friend whose stepmom actually turned this into kind of an operational principle. So she was a travel agent and on planes all the time and decided that when she didn't want to talk to people, she'd tell them she was an astrophysicist. And this actually worked really well for her for many years until one day, the guy in the aisle seat next to her, she says, yeah, I'm an astrophysicist. And he says, that's amazing. So am I.
Oh, wow.
So she's caught in this awkward situation of her own making. And so she immediately admitted her lie. And rather than being upset, the guy thought it was hilarious. They eventually became friends as a result of this harmless social white lie. But later on, the guy and her stepson, who's a childhood friend of mine, they went on to start a successful solar energy business. So the moral of the story is that if you want to make friends and help your family succeed in business, lie about being an astrophysicist on airplanes. I think that's good advice for your listeners. But since I actually am an astrophysicist, I can't lie about that on airplanes. But anybody else, feel free to use it as you see fit.
I love it. Well, Andy, thank you for sharing a little bit about the work that you do. And I think being able to answer some of these big questions and maybe work towards better understanding our universe is really exciting and maybe inherently motivating for you, it sounds like. But I love gathering bits of motivation and inspiration from everybody that I talk to and sharing them with our listeners. So do you have a favorite quote or a saying or just a force in life that you find really motivates you or resonates with you?
I wouldn't necessarily call it a motivational quote, but it's certainly something that motivates me. So it comes from the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke, who said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I don't believe that we can ever live in a world with actual magic because I don't believe in the supernatural. But frankly, the real world itself to me is way more amazing than any magic that we can imagine. And what this quote from Clarke means to me is that most of the things we can imagine, we'll probably eventually figure out how to make them real in the world in some way. So this is admittedly an extremely optimistic view of future technology. But what it also tells me is that without actual magic in the world, it means that, let's say we want to cure some disease or be able to fly or be able to travel to the stars. It means that there's no shortcuts. We have to do all the hard work and we actually have to understand science and how the universe works. But most of the time, if we can imagine it, we can probably make something like it happen. So a perfect example of science fiction magic is the Force from Star Wars. It would be really awesome if I could use the Force and just telekinetically move the coffee cup with my mind. But in trying to do that, we're kind of ignoring the fact that we actually can already move the coffee cup with our mind. But it involves some intermediate steps, including I've got to reach over and touch it. It's something we kind of take for granted, but it all began in my mind and I used my mind to influence the world. And when you build some sort of technology based on your scientific understanding of the world and do something like that, it would look like magic to people from the past, depending on how advanced it is. I mean, if you think about your iPhone, think about the digital screens that are in our lives so much, for better or for worse, those things would blow the mind of somebody 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. So I think that if we survive as a civilization, we're going to be able to build some pretty amazing things.
Absolutely. And I think with the advent of some of these computer brain interfaces, you could hypothetically, with your mind, move something via a prosthetic, like you said.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. It doesn't involve any actual magic. But yeah, I've read about some of that research where people are using neural interfaces to bypass paralyzed limbs and allow people to control a robotic arm that's attached to themselves as if it was their own arm, or to remotely control the radio signals, some mechanical device halfway around the world. And that basically would qualify as magic to any observer throughout most of human history. But those things are on the verge of becoming reality.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of science and technology today can just instill a sense of wonder and maybe inspire people to continue working in particular areas. And when we think about what inspires you, are there particular individuals that you can point to who maybe served as mentors or role models or just figures that you looked up to over the course of your career, Andy?
I'm certainly not alone in this, but as an astronomer, Carl Sagan was a huge role model for me. Nobody could pull off the turtleneck quite like Dr. Sagan. So I love the original Cosmos TV series, and I was influenced profoundly by all of his books, including the book Cosmos. And he was just such a lucid writer. So I was exposed to him as a writer before as a scientist. So I just really, really appreciated the big picture perspective that he was able to convey and the kinds of insights that he was able to share about our place in the universe and about how life came to be, how our planet formed, how stars form, how the universe is an amazing place where stars live and die and they produce all the heavy elements that eventually become planets and people. That basic fact that we're all made of material that was once inside of a star is something that he was very, very good at communicating. But it's still sort of sad to me that those kinds of things that we know about our origins are still unknown to billions of people on Earth. I kind of view the story of cosmic history as we know it from the Big Bang until today as something that is the birthright of all human beings. And I wish more people had been able to be exposed to Carl Sagan. And admittedly, millions were, but there are also billions of people who've never heard of him or who've never heard of the ideas that he was discussing about our place in the universe. And I think that the cosmic perspective is something that we desperately need in the modern day as we're trying to figure out a way to survive as a civilization.
Certainly. And I think it's really helpful to have that perspective to sort of get outside of the minutia of your own life that may be going wrong, to take that bigger picture and appreciate life a little bit differently.
Absolutely. And one thing that I get asked a lot doing what I do is, how do I cope with the extreme vastness and emptiness and the daunting scale of the universe, both in size and in age? I mean, we think the universe is about 14 billion years old. Depending on the way you count the size of the universe could be 46 billion light years across, if you think about it from a cosmological perspective. And compared to like the size of the room I'm in or the Earth, it makes a lot of people who are not in the field, to the extent that they think about it, feel that we're small and unimportant. But the cosmic perspective has definitely helped me kind of reframe that a little bit in the following sense. It turns out that because it takes so much time for stars to form and for them to build up chemical complexity, to burn hydrogen to helium to oxygen and eventually to iron, it takes many generations and billions of years to build up the material that eventually formed the cloud of gas and dust that condensed into our solar system. So it turns out that the immense age of the universe is kind of a prerequisite for our existence. And then there's a lot of uncertainty about how long it takes for life to evolve and how common it might be. But regardless, it takes many billions of years for that to happen. So the fact that we find ourselves in a universe that's this old is actually something that's required for us to even be here in the first place. And then the universe is also expanding. But in addition, the time since the Big Bang allows light to travel further and further, so we can see further and further. And because of this, it's essentially guaranteed that if we evolve and find ourselves alive in this universe, we're going to find ourselves in a very small part of a very large universe. So rather than making me feel small, there's a sense in which the huge timescales and size scales of the universe are necessary for us to even exist in the first place. So that's one of the things that helps me to not fear the void and the emptiness. It's not there as a waste of space. It's actually, to the extent that we think of ourselves as important, it could not have been otherwise.
Well, I think you are so passionate about your science, and it comes through in how you talk about it. And I think that's really critical for scientists, having this passion to keep driving them forward. But I'm curious to hear a little bit more, Andy, about how this interest in science and maybe astronomy and physics began. Can you take us all the way back to the beginning and share some of these earliest memories of yours of first being interested in science?
I think that for me, at least, and I'm not alone in this, science fiction served as a gateway drug to science. I grew up in a house filled with books and movies and lots of critical thinking, especially from my dad, who was a doctor, and lots of trips to the science museum with my parents. And my problem has kind of always been that I've been interested in too many things. And one time in undergrad, I thought it was a good idea for some reason to triple major in physics, math, and art.
Oh, wow. Because
I was exposed to so much stuff from all those realms growing up. And I ended up dropping the math and the art when it appeared that I wouldn't be able to graduate for like 20 years. Double majored in physics and astronomy. And having been a lifelong sci-fi fan, the astronomy appealed to me especially because, like many others, I always dreamed of going into space. But by the time I entered college, it was pretty clear that becoming an astronaut was probably too difficult and too dangerous. And since, unfortunately, it's not yet the 24th century here yet, I think that's why I ended up in astrophysics, because it's kind of the next best way that you can connect to the universe without actually physically traveling into it, which is currently not practical for most of humanity. But I am excited about the opportunities for space travel will eventually be safe and affordable for many, many more people. That's already kind of beginning to happen with the privatization of space. But I think that when you realize that you can't get on a starship that has an impeccable safety record and somehow finds a way to block out the turbulence and the G-forces with magical technology, then staying here on Earth and studying the universe is a great kind of consolation prize.
Absolutely. And your mention of considering majoring in art piqued my interest here. What kind of art were you doing?
I've always been fascinated with M.C. Escher and the geometric art that he did. There's a big connection between art and science in the way that we represent the mathematical descriptions of the theories we're working on, in the way that we represent data. A lot of presentation of scientific data and results is about visualization, and there's an artistic component to it too. So these kinds of things, geometric art, which I was really, really interested in for a while, I think it led naturally to some of the things that I still do today. And instead of doing it by hand, now it's mostly done with software. But the way that you choose to visualize something, a lot of the same creative ideas that are required for art are applicable here.
Absolutely. So we got to the point in your career path where you'd winnowed down your interest to physics and astrophysics. What then are some of the next steps, Andy, that really took you from that very early stage in your career to where you are today?
Well, it's kind of interesting how when you think about your path, there are a lot of choice points that have a lot to do with luck. Ultimately, I ended up working for a really, really cool undergraduate research group where we were looking for exploding stars in images. And because I ended up working with Alex Filipenko at UC Berkeley as an undergrad, that experience made it possible to get into a number of physics and astronomy grad schools. And then in graduate school, so much of your success as a scientist depends on whether or not you're lucky enough to work with an advisor who is supportive and treats you as a human being. So I did astronomy grad school at Harvard ultimately, and was very, very lucky to work with Bob Kirshner, an expert in supernova explosions. It's very hard to imagine the kind of support from other advisors. Mm-hmm. Graduate student experiences are kind of all over the map, and it dramatically depends on whether or not you're lucky to work with a group and with people who treat you as human beings rather than intellectual output machines who are designed to just further their research, whatever the cost to you. So I was just really lucky to have very, very inspiring mentors in undergrad and grad school. And also as a postdoctoral fellow, I've had a chance to work with David Kaiser and Alan Guth at MIT, and they've been unbelievably supportive. And the research that kind of occupies most of my thought these days is based on a project that we all started together. But again, so much luck was involved in being at the right place at the right time to be able to connect with the right people.
Certainly. And then how did you find yourself then getting a position there at the Center for Astrophysics and Space Sciences at the University of California, San Diego?
I'm originally from San Diego, and I had always wanted to return to be close to family. So my position is a research position. So in the academic world, if you want a tenure track faculty position, they're incredibly hard to come by these days. So if you really want to maximize your chances of that, you have to kind of stay in the job market for potentially several cycles. You have to be willing to apply all around the country and the world. And my wife and I and my family, it was a priority to try to find some way to come back to San Diego. So essentially, I ended up connecting with Brian Keating, who's a professor here at UC San Diego, and coming in the summer as a visitor for several years and collaborating with him on a number of things. And ultimately, we were able to find a way to create a position that was very complementary to all the things we were interested in doing. And Brian was involved in the grant that we were fortunate to get from the U.S. National Science Foundation about 5 years ago, along with my MIT colleagues and Jason Glickio, who's now at Harvey Mudd College. And that grant funding in the modern scientific funding climate is also incredibly competitive. So again, so much of what allowed me to end up here in San Diego was based on a lot of luck. I mean, there was a lot of hard work and a lot of persistence, but a lot of it had to do with being able to get that grant at the right time, be connected to the right collaborators, and then to find a way to have a position created that didn't exist.
Definitely. And I love your story because I think it really highlights that you have to be proactive about some of these opportunities, some of these things that you want, because like you had said, you had identified that you really weren't interested in searching for some of these faculty positions all over the country or all over the world. You wanted to be in a particular area. There wasn't necessarily an opportunity at the moment, but you had an open mind and you were able to make a path for yourself to get a position ultimately. And I think thinking outside the box and being creative is becoming more and more important for maybe some of our listeners out there who are trying to establish their own careers.
Absolutely. I'm not saying that the particular path I took will work for everybody. There was certainly a big risk. And I do think that it is totally reasonable to take credit for specific things that you did. I think that being proactive was a positive thing, but it was by no means guaranteed, and I couldn't have done it without a whole lot of help from other people. But I was fortunate to be able to understand priorities, and as much as being a tenure track faculty member somewhere would have been awesome, I realized that being close to family was more important as far as priority, and just tried to do everything we could to maximize the chances of that happening.
Absolutely. And Andy, you are able to work on so many different projects in your current position, a lot of cool research going on. So is there one in particular that you want to share with us today and tell us a little bit more about?
Yeah, so this is the project that we were fortunate to get funding for from the National Science Foundation several years ago, and it's still ongoing. So one of the things that I'm interested in is studying the foundations of quantum mechanics. That's our most fundamental theory of the subatomic world. When you're talking about particles of light, photons, electrons, atoms, the very small. And quantum theory has been unbelievably successful. It's probably the best tested physical theory we've ever created. It's been around for a century. And by some estimates, maybe 30 to 40% of the GDP of the world is based on quantum-enabled technologies. So you're talking about every computer, every digital display, lasers, telecommunications, you name it. The technological applications of quantum theory are everywhere in our lives. But from a foundation standpoint, it's actually kind of an embarrassment, but experts in the field still can't agree on what the theory actually means. What is it actually telling us about what's happening? What's the story about the world that we can tell that everyone will agree upon about what quantum theory is saying? We know how to use it. So many physicists for many years have adopted the so-called shut up and calculate attitude, which is the idea that it works. Why should we care about all these philosophical concerns? I definitely find myself very much interested, actually, in the philosophical concerns, but for several reasons. One, of course, you could take the view that science is about building things, and of course it's important. But to me, it's about understanding the world, and it's about telling a story about what's going on that we can understand to the extent that we can. And I don't think we should ever give up on that. And in addition, if we stop asking those foundational questions, then we run into the possibility of not being able to think about the next theory beyond quantum mechanics. So there are currently two major pillars of fundamental physics. So one is quantum mechanics, which governs the very small. And then we have Einstein's theory of gravity, general relativity, which governs very large scales in the universe. So the entire expansion of the universe, stars, galaxies, black holes, all that kind of stuff. But we also know that the two theories are irreconcilable in some way. They don't play nice in areas where they overlap. So almost everyone in the community knows that neither quantum mechanics or general relativity is probably the final story. So everyone is searching in some way for a so-called theory of quantum gravity that merges the two together. So one way to approach that is to, let's say, look at the foundations of quantum mechanics and ask about some of the weirdest features of quantum mechanics and think about new experiments you can do to try to understand that. So the concept that we've been trying to think about and test is quantum entanglement. It's one of the weirdest features of quantum mechanics. So basically, if you have a pair of entangled particles, if you measure something about one, then you instantly know something about a measurement outcome in the future on its partner. And this is true no matter how far away they are from each other, no matter when they became entangled in the past. And to many, it sort of appears Einstein called this spooky action at a distance because he did not like quantum entanglement. He thought that quantum mechanics as a theory had to be incomplete because it was describing what looked like instantaneous, so it looked like magic to him. So he was not okay with entanglement. And for many years, Einstein's ideas were sort of stuck in this philosophical corner. But in the 1960s, a physicist named John Bell came up with a very, very famous theorem called Bell's theorem that actually sort of says, well, let's say on the one hand you have quantum mechanics, and on the other hand, let's say you have a world that's more like what Einstein wanted. In Einstein's world, there wasn't any instantaneous action at a distance. Einstein was the inventor of relativity. Nothing can travel faster than light. So if I want to influence something far away, I've got to send some signal to it that's going at the speed of light or slower. That's a world where the world is local. So things have to bump into each other in order to influence each other. Interestingly, John Bell figured out that you could actually do an experiment to test whether Einstein's worldview and the quantum worldview were correct. And this led to some interesting foundational experiments where you take entangled particles, you choose how to measure them on either side. Let's say you have two observers, one's named Alice, one's named Bob. You look at their measurement outcomes. So let's say the things that are entangled are photons, particles of light, that are entangled with respect to their polarization. So if you've ever seen polarized sunglasses, basically what you have is a filter that's letting in light with a certain polarization and blocking light with other polarizations. Some of us have experience with polarization on that level. But if you have particles that are entangled with respect to their polarization, you can imagine that sometimes you have like a polarizing filter that Alice is using that's oriented at some angle, and either the photon will go through or it won't. And then Bob has something similar. He might orient his polarizing filter at some other angle. And when Alice and Bob measure a bunch of their measurement outcomes, which are things like it went through or it didn't, it looks like a random series of outcomes. But when they're later compared, you see correlations in the measurement outcomes that are very mysterious. So we often talk about photons having either horizontal or vertical polarization. And in quantum theory, these entangled photons can each be in a so-called superposition of horizontal and vertical. So the photon going to Alice might have some probability of being found to be horizontal, some probability of being found to be vertical. But Alice sees what looks like essentially a set of random outcomes. So in advance, she can't know whether the photon's going to go through or not, whether she's going to measure horizontal or vertical or not. It's like a random series of horizontal and verticals. Same thing with Bob. So there's a bunch of random processes that look like they're going on, but when you compare them later, you see these correlations where the measurement outcomes line up more than they should if the world was like what Einstein wanted, but they match perfectly what quantum mechanics claims. So this has led to a whole field of new technologies that are based on using entanglement and using these weird correlations, which are not explainable in terms of a physical worldview that Einstein wanted to be true. So you might think the story ends there, but even though all the experiments so far have been consistent with quantum mechanics, and it seems like Einstein was wrong here, because he's such a lauded figure in the history of physics and science, people like to jump on the idea of, oh, Einstein was wrong in this case. Like that gets people really excited. Mm-hmm. But interestingly, the story has not been completely closed because there are interesting loopholes in these experiments that would still allow Einstein's worldview to be true. And essentially what we try to do in this field is you try to do experiments where you progressively close each of the loopholes. So for example, one of the loopholes would be, let's say you do the experiment really slowly. And if there was time for some signal to go from Alice's side to Bob's side that alerted them in advance about, let's say, what Alice's measurement setting was going to be, let's say the angle of her polarizing filter or the outcome she was going to get, then it's long been known that some other theory aside from quantum mechanics would be able to use that information to fake quantum mechanics to give the same predictions. There could be some other theory under the hood. So you can close that loophole if instead of doing the experiment slowly, you make your measurement choices extremely rapidly. So you shoot out the entangled particles, and while they're still in flight, at the very last second, Alice and Bob each choose the angles at which they're measuring the polarization of the photons. So that's one way to close a loophole having to do with potential hidden communication. But interestingly, we're interested in a different loophole. It's the so-called freedom of choice loophole. So when Alice and Bob are choosing the angles of their polarizing filters, you might think that they have completely free choice in the sense that a free choice is something that couldn't be predicted by anybody else. It couldn't be predicted by anything in the past. So if we assume that Alice and Bob's experimental choices are completely free, then you can draw the conclusion from these experiments that Einstein was wrong and quantum mechanics is right. But if it turns out that their choices are not completely free, maybe they're correlated with some things in the past of the experiment, then that opens up possibility of this loophole. So what we did is instead of making choices with anything on Earth, where signals from a few microseconds or milliseconds ago could have influenced both sides of the experiment, we instead outsourced the experimental choices to the universe. So instead of letting random number generators on Earth or people make the choices, we use the color of light from distant astronomical objects. So stars in our galaxy is what we started with, and eventually we use big telescopes to observe light from these distant galaxies called quasars, where the light has been on its way for billions of years. And depending on whether the light was red or blue, we use that like a 1 or a 0 to either change the angle of our measurement setting, our polarization filter, or not. So we did an entanglement experiment where we chose the real-time measurement settings with events that took place really, really far away in space and time. So what we can say is that we can't fully close this loophole, but we address it by saying that if something else other than quantum mechanics was going to exploit the loophole, it would have had to have done so a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, billions and billions of years ago. So we're shrinking the place in space and time where something else besides quantum mechanics could explain this weird, spooky action at a distance that you see in entanglement experiments. That project is called the Cosmic Bell Experiment. And we were able to collaborate with Anton Zeilinger's quantum optics group in Vienna, Austria. And with our US team together, we were able to do this experiment in 2018. And it's kind of amazing to have been part of that, to have thought of the idea with colleagues and then to actually see it happen in the real world. It's been pretty amazing.
Absolutely. Well, Andy, this is fascinating. Thank you for sharing more about this project. And I can imagine that there are some challenges just in designing some of these complex experiments. And you do have to get fairly creative to come up with solutions to get around a lot of these challenges. And I love talking about the difficulties, the failures, some of the problems that scientists face, because I think not everybody gets to hear about these. Oftentimes you only see the success and the accolades at the end. So do you have a challenge or a failure story that you can dive into and share with us how you worked through it?
Absolutely. I think that there is definitely a selection bias where you hear about the successes in the headlines in the science media. This is not limited to science. In every area of endeavor, things that people don't want to publicize tend to not get publicized. Mm-hmm. In many ways, academia is insulated from the real world, but it's a very competitive and harsh place. In addition to just the competition for jobs, like we were discussing before, it is increasingly difficult to get funding to do our work. So when you're talking about failure for this particular project, I can't tell you how many times we applied for funding to try to get this project going, only to hear resounding no's for what we thought were unreasonable reasons. So because our project was so out of the box and so cross-disciplinary, it involved ideas from quantum optics, from observational astronomy, from the foundations of quantum theory. Every time we applied to some subset of some funding agency, they would say, oh, this is interesting, but you should actually be applying to this other place. And then we'd apply to the other place, and then they tell us to go back to the first one. And it was very frustrating. And because it was so cross-disciplinary, the review committees for these grants, they do their best. And the program officers at the foundations, like the U.S. National Science Foundation, they do their best to find a group of qualified people. But when you have a really weird project, a lot of the people on the panel are not necessarily qualified to evaluate it. They might have a fundamental misunderstanding of what you're trying to do. So we got a lot of rejections and disagreed strongly with the criticism, but you don't really have recourse if you get rejected, except to just apply again the next time. So there were many, many rounds of failed attempts. And when we finally did get funding from the NSF a few years ago, it was just a huge, huge sigh of relief. But what led up to that was a sequence of many, many failures, and persistence is required. But at the end of the day, so much of this has to do with luck, because you have to get the right committee to get the right group of people on your panel, and you have no control over that. And sometimes, whether you get a grant or not, or whether you get a job or not, independent of your own merit and qualifications, sometimes it has to do with whether or not the committee had recently eaten lunch, right. Whether they were in a good mood or not. So I've long learned to not outsource my self-worth to any kind of committee process, and to just realize that there's just a lot of randomness and luck involved in everything we try to do, so that when we do succeed, it's really important to stay humble about it. You can look back on the things that you did right and give yourself credit for that, but that's always important to acknowledge the role of luck.
Certainly. So Andy, what kept you going when you were facing rejection after rejection for this project?
I was just really, really passionate about the idea, and my colleagues were too. And it took time to find the right program that was specifically designed for ideas that didn't fit under a neat category. I think that you do have to have persistence, and you do have to learn how to not take rejection personally, and to realize that if you believe in the ideas, then it's worth fighting for. Now, even if you do that, that does not guarantee success. But I thought that it was worth doing. I had great colleagues and great support, and we kept improving the proposal, and finally we hit. So I think that that was one of the big reasons why I was able to stick with it, just because it was surrounded by so many good people who were also passionate.
Absolutely. And this specific case of toil and trouble ended with a success, and we love talking about the successes as well. So do you have a favorite success story you'd like to share, whether it's diving into a little bit more detail on this one or a completely different example?
Yeah, so on the heels of this successful experiment, we were able to publish a paper, and we got a lot of positive science media coverage, which is a lot of fun. And personally, I feel like the reason we do science is to learn about the world and to share it as widely as possible with others. So whenever there's science media coverage, I think that's wonderful because it extends the reach. So if you're talking about publishing a scientific paper, if 10 people cite it, it's moderately successful. If 100 people cite it and 1,000 people read it, it's amazingly successful. But if your science gets discussed in the New York Times, millions of people get to see it. So that's pretty incredible. As far as a big success goes, the sort of icing on the cake was that we were able to work with the PBS show Nova. They actually did a documentary about our experiment. The episode is called Einstein's Quantum Riddle, and it aired in early 2019. And I grew up watching Nova. It's kind of the flagship science show of PBS. And it was just so amazing to see this project that I had helped to come up with the idea for and had thought to make happen in the real world, and discussed on this high production value science television show that I've been watching since I was a kid. And in the spring of 2019, we had a screening and panel discussion at UC San Diego. And it was just so cool to be able to talk about that experience and to be able to share that with the audience and to have that on YouTube. And then I was able to talk about it also at a panel at San Diego Comic-Con this past year. So it's just really fun to be in a position where I'm getting to talk about these things that I'm so passionate about in these venues, whether it's the science media, seeing our work discussed on Nova, Comic-Con. It's just kind of a dream come true. All these fun things that I loved as a kid, I kind of get to really play around in a different way as an adult. It's been a pretty amazing journey.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations to you and the team on this big success. And I know science communication opportunities can be amazing, but they can also be kind of daunting or intimidating. Was that the case for you? Were you nervous going into some of these opportunities?
Even though I've given, I don't know how many public talks by now, there's always a little bit of butterflies. And I've had a chance to do podcasts and other kinds of public outreach in the past. And I think that it's more fun than daunting at this point, because I guess for me, that it's the easiest thing in the world to talk about the stuff that I love, and sharing it with you and your audience is not that big of a leap from sharing it with somebody in my living room. So I just think it's really fun. And thank you again for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And I know as a scientist, you are constantly immersed in reading scientific articles or being engaged in science communication. And I think one of the things that we love getting from our guests on the show are book recommendations to learn what you are reading outside of the literature, whether it's related to science or not. So Andy, do you have a favorite book that you've really enjoyed and want to recommend for me and our listeners today?
I'm kind of a voracious reader, so it's kind of hard to narrow it down. But as far as like an introduction to the cosmic perspective, Cosmos by Carl Sagan, which we talked about before, is something that I highly recommend to anybody. And if you're talking about science fiction, which is kind of what got me started, the science fiction books of David Brin, the Uplift trilogy, is a fantastic galactic space opera about sentient aliens and animals like dolphins and chimpanzees being uplifted to consciousness so that we can talk to them. And having a dog now, I often wonder what it would be like to talk to him, as many pet owners do. But interestingly, I'm mentioning David Brin in particular because of this work on the Cosmic Bell Project, and because he's a San Diego native. He was the science fiction writer that I read growing up and was incredibly inspired by. But I've actually been able to become friends with him, and we've given public talks together at UCSD. So I've been very fortunate to make these connections and to kind of have a lot of the through lines of the things that motivated me throughout life coming full circle growing up, and especially coming full circle returning back to the place where I grew up.
Oh, that's so cool. Well, Andy, we will add Cosmos by Carl Sagan as well as David Brin's Uplift series to our book list on our website for our listeners to find out there. And we've chatted about a lot of different aspects of your career, but one of the things we haven't really gone into detail on yet are some of the opportunities that you've had to travel. And I think this is a phenomenal part of a scientist's career because you get to go to so many places, meet wonderful people, and share your research. So do you have a favorite place that your science has taken you?
I think that one of the most memorable trips for me was a collaboration meeting in Vienna, Austria. It turned out that the U.S. team that worked on the Cosmic Bell experiment included people that were astronomers and cosmologists, and some of us had some experimental background, like Jason Galicchio at Harvey Mudd College. But for the stuff we wanted to do, it turned out that Anton Zeilinger and his quantum optics group in Vienna, they were really some of the world leaders in some of the stuff that we didn't know how to do. But at the same time, we were also experts in astronomy and cosmology in a way that complemented their group. So it was really, really awesome to be able to connect with them. First, when Anton was giving a physics colloquium at MIT, I think back in 2013. And then eventually we formed this collaboration, and several of us, David Kaiser and Jason Galicchio and Hien Nguyen and I, were able to travel to Vienna. It was a multi-day collaboration meeting, and I had prepared this very detailed presentation. So this is different than like a talk at a conference. This was going to be talking to my colleagues who were going to grill me about every little detail for hours. So we all went to lunch, and then I was scheduled to give this big presentation afterwards. And I don't remember the name of the restaurant, but I went to the bathroom, and it was like down in the basement, and it must have been like an old bank vault or something. But this is Austria, and I didn't speak German. And as I'm trying to leave the bathroom, I realized that the lock wouldn't budge.
Oh, no.
I was like, okay, I got an international cell phone plan for the visit. I'll text my friends. And then I realized, oh my God, I'm behind this bank vault door. I've got no reception. So I'm about to give the biggest presentation of my life, and I'm trapped in this bank vault bathroom.
No.
So I ended up trapped in there for maybe 20 or 30 minutes, knocking on the door. And finally somebody came, and I found somebody who spoke English, and they had to open the door from the outside. And then he says, I'm sorry, this happens all the time. That lock's broken.
Oh, jeez.
I'm pretty sure my colleagues would have come for me eventually. But I was sort of thinking, like, what would have happened if I had not been able to give that presentation? It ended up being very successful. And I think I spoke to the group for 3 hours after that. But Vienna, independent of that, was just such an amazing, historical, beautiful city. Just being able to talk about the most exciting project that I ever worked on with the group of people who really cared about it the most was just very, very fun.
Oh, that sounds both terrifying and amazing at the same time. Being trapped in small places makes me very nervous. So.
Oh, fair enough.
So was this your first time to Vienna?
Yeah, I had never been to Vienna before. I'd been to Europe, but first time there and hope to go again. And it's definitely a whole different world.
Were you able to do any sightseeing? And are there any particular sites you can recommend for me and our listeners?
One of the things that was really, really interesting is we went to this well-known cemetery. And one of the reasons to do that was that a whole bunch of historical luminaries were buried there. And as physicists, we immediately went to the grave of Ludwig Boltzmann, a physicist who was involved in the foundations of thermodynamics. So that's just a memory that connects for me, just thinking about the history of physics and thinking that our group were playing a small part in that too.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing this travel experience. And we've touched on just the phenomenal people you've been able to work with over the course of the career on these different projects. And I think scientists don't always get a good reputation in the media. We're still combating some stereotypes that people have about what scientists are like and what life as a scientist is like. And we try to break these stereotypes on our show by really highlighting the human elements of science, whether it's fun traditions you see in different labs or just quirky, funny memories that you've shared with colleagues. So, Andy, do you have a story of your own that really highlights this human side of science?
I haven't been an experimentalist myself, so I haven't worked in traditional lab settings, but I have worked in institutions where I've been surrounded by amazing colleagues. And it's true, in my biased opinion, that scientists are often more funny and more interesting than many other groups of people, even though the stereotype in the media might be that, as you were saying, scientists are often thought of as these dry, humorless, rational beings who, if you ask them how they're doing, they say, nominal. I find that, of course, science is filled with lots of tremendously weird people. Absolutely. But I do think that there's lots of really, really funny, brilliant people. Mm-hmm. So in another life, when I was in grad school, I think this kind of gets to the spirit of your question. I used to run the Harvard grad student comedy magazine. It was called the Harvard Satirical Press. I don't know if you've read The Onion, but it was very similar to that, news format, satire. But we kind of had more of a science bent because many of the writers were scientists, physicists and astronomers and fellow grad students. And I think this worked because, by and large, there's a lot of really creative, funny people in the field. And sometimes somebody who might come across as awkward in person actually is a hilarious writer. So if you're talking about comedy writing, you should recruit scientists. If you're Saturday Night Live and you're looking for somebody, try to find some scientists.
I'm behind it 100%.
Thank you. And everybody in grad school, whether they were a scientist or not, was a nerd of some sort. I've been a nerd my entire life. I'm very proud of it. I think that nerds are some of the best people. And if anybody thinks differently, you should give nerds a chance.
That's right. Well, I love this idea of you being involved with this comedy magazine because I think you're absolutely right. People don't necessarily appreciate that scientists do have this sense of humor. I think the sense of humor is really important to get you through some of the tough times, to help you be creative and answer some of these really tough questions that you're working on. And I know oftentimes there are things standing in the way, maybe particularly in your field of astrophysics, when you're trying to answer these huge questions about the universe. So Andy, if we gave you everything you could dream of today, whether that's funding, staff, technology, changing the feasibility of the experiment you're trying to do, what is the one question you would most want to answer?
That's a great question. And kind of backing up just a little bit, I think that having a sense of humor is kind of a requirement to be able to survive the challenges of almost any profession, whether it's science or anything else, and to not take yourself too seriously. And actually, if you were to ask me, if an alien civilization came and visited us and was looking at all the terrible things that humanity has done, and they're putting us on trial and asking us, why should humanity survive? I think our sense of humor is probably one of the leading points in our favor. That is a redeeming quality, which tilts the balance towards saying we deserve to have a future in this universe. So that's just backing up a little bit. But circling around to what if I could work on any project I wanted, if funding wasn't an issue? Mm-hmm. That's where I'd like some magic. I think it would be really, really awesome to try to design experiments that really get to the heart of talking about what quantum theory is actually all about. And one of the most interesting and speculative aspects of quantum theory is that there are some interpretations of quantum theory that would seem to predict the existence of other universes. This is something which is actually talked about quite seriously in theoretical physics these days, and it depends on how you define another universe. But if you're talking about something that, at least to us right now, appears to be unobservable even in principle, there's kind of a debate over the soul of science as to, do these theories that predict another universe or an infinite number of them, do they count as science? And I think that you should always try to do some kind of an experimental test if you can. You should always try to have a hypothesis that you could falsify if possible. But just because something right now doesn't appear to be experimentally testable in the way that you might think, if I had infinite funding and support, I would love to try to go after this question of, could we actually design an experiment that gives us definitive evidence of the existence of other universes that somehow leave an imprint on things that we can observe locally right here, even though they might appear to be, at first glance, so far away that we could never interact with them or in an entirely different realm of space and time in general. That's what I would go after if I didn't have any constraints.
Very interesting. I like it. And I think that thinking big, despite some of the constraints you face in your daily life and your daily science, is helpful and maybe good for stimulating some ideas and creativity. And for our listeners out there who might be looking for a way to stimulate their own creativity to get through a particular point in their career that they are struggling with, do you have any particular advice that you can share, Andy? Something that maybe really helped you at some point in your career that you can pay forward to our listeners today?
One of the things that I like to say, which is just sort of a mantra, which I found really helpful, is to be kind to your future self. You're going to be your future self any minute now. So the more you do right now to front load things that are going to help you in the future, the better off you'll be. And you could call it in a more mundane way. You could just say, well, call it planning ahead or don't procrastinate. But saying it that way never really registered with me in the same way. But saying be kind to your future self really works, at least for me, because it makes you realize that who you are right now was once the future self of your past self, and whatever you did in the past to help you make your life easier or better right now, thinking that way makes it easier to make good choices right now that are going to help you in the future. I just think that that's something which has really, really worked for me.
I like it. I think that's excellent advice. And as someone who maybe as a grad student found myself saying future me problem a lot, I think that's really helpful. Now, is there any other last message or last piece of advice you want to leave me and our listeners with today?
I think that this is kind of a common theme which has popped up throughout the discussion, but I just think that no matter what career path you're on, whether it's science or something else, it's just extremely important to acknowledge the role of luck in all of our lives and to approach things with humility. Unfortunately, I found this phenomenon, and it's certainly true in science. If people have a huge amount of success, it's really easy for them to not be aware of their own cognitive biases and to try to tell a story of their life as an unbroken series of awesome, amazing decisions, that they were brilliant and had foresight every single time. And that, unfortunately, is not an accurate way of describing anyone's path, and that we tend to dramatically underestimate the role of luck in our lives. Even if it just comes down to this question of what time and what location on Earth were you born, that's definitely beyond our control. And I know that whatever successes I've been able to achieve were dramatically influenced by being born at the right time, at the right place, with the right family and the right situations. So I think that this perspective helps us be less judgmental of other people who haven't been as fortunate, and to realize that there's no doubt that you have to be proactive. You have to take risks. You have to be ambitious. You have to try to promote the things that you want to do. You have to try to solicit help elsewhere. But that ultimately, for somebody who doesn't achieve certain successes, it very often does not have to do with their merit or their talent. It has to do with whether they know the right people or whether they are lucky in all sorts of various ways. And I think that humility is sorely lacking in modern society in many ways, and that it's a very healthy thing to cultivate and to be proud of the things you've accomplished, but to really separate the things that you bear primary responsibility for and the other things where it really wasn't you. It was really just luck. I've been very fortunate, and there's a lot of challenges in the particular career path that I've had, but I kind of feel like what I get to do is one of the best jobs in the world, and I feel super lucky to be able to do it. But it wasn't all just hard work. It certainly required a lot of that, but that alone would not have been enough to allow me to be in the position that I'm in and to be as fortunate as I have been with a career in science.
Well, Andy, you've brought up a lot of important points here, and we had a great conversation today. We covered a lot of ground. If our listeners are intrigued and they want to learn more about you and your work, where should they go or how should they get in touch?
I have a research website at UC San Diego and at MIT. The UCSD one is asfriedman.physics.ucsd.edu. I'm also on Twitter at AndyFriedman2, and those are the best ways to reach out. It's a lot of fun to hear from people who are interested in talking about these crazy things, and I hope that some of these ideas have been fun to think about.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Andy, for your time today. Listeners, definitely get in touch with him if you have any questions. Check out that website. And Andy, we've had such a wonderful time learning more about you and your work.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a pleasure. And listeners, great to have you here as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.